It's been a bit of an up and down week for Kendra and for me. At the beginning of the week, I received a phone call from my father in New Mexico telling us that my stepmother, Sally, had just been transported to a hospital in Texas, and we weren't sure that she was going to make it through the night. And so we suddenly found ourselves in a very low place at the beginning of the week. And then over the next few days, there was a slight improvement in her condition, a slight stabilizing in her condition, a little more optimism on the part of the medical team providing care for her. And so we felt like we began to come up a little bit from that low space. And yet things are still so grave that I'm headed out later this afternoon for Texas and New Mexico to try to provide some relief for family members who've been providing care over this time. And it's interesting that all of that has happened as I was working on the final draft of the lesson for this morning, because our text this morning is a text of highs and lows, a text of many different contrasts, especially when we look at all 20 verses in Matthew 17, 1 through 20. Because on the one hand, there are some followers of Jesus who are high up on a mountain, and at the same time, there are some followers of Jesus who are down low in a valley. And so we read again in Matthew 17:1, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. But we also read verse 9, 14 through 16, as they were coming down from the mountain, they came to the crowd. A man came to them, knelt before him, and said, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has epilepsy and suffers terribly. He often falls into the pit and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him." There are followers of Jesus high up on a mountain. There are followers of Jesus down low in the valley. And that geography feels important. Mountains play an important role in the storyline of the Bible. There's Mount Sinai, where Moses receives the law. There's the mount from which Jesus preaches his sermon on the mount. There is this Mount of Transfiguration. There's the mount from which Jesus commissions his disciples to go into all the world. And valleys play a significant role in the storyline of the Bible. There's the Valley of Eshcol, where Moses' spies search out the promised land, the Valley of Elah, where David and Goliath meet. There's the Valley of the Shadow of Death that David writes about in Psalm 23. There's the Valley of the Dry Bones that Ezekiel writes about in terms of the restoration of the people of God. And once again, in one spot, we have mountains and valleys. On the one hand, those in the mountain in this text are in the presence of Jesus, and those in the valley seem to be in the absence of Jesus. Those up on the mountain enjoy unparalleled connection with Jesus, and those in the valley seem to be suffering from the absence of Jesus. Those up on the mountain are delighted by this radiant glory of Jesus. There's awe experienced by them up there on the mountain. And those in the valley are disheartened by the troubling suffering of those around them. There's a father unable to cure his son, provide for his ailing son. There's the son ailing. There are the disciples who seem unable to do anything about it. The exact opposite experience of those up on the mountain. All of this has been captured, I think, well in a painting by an Italian artist named Raphael. It's a two-part painting, and that's the genius of the painting. Most images of this text in Matthew 17 focus only on the top part, and Raphael has given us the top and the bottom, the high and the low. The top part of the painting is what we tend to focus on. In the first few verses of Matthew 17, it's the radiant transfiguration of Jesus, and the scene is filled with light and glory. Moses and Elijah there with Jesus, the disciples there, holding their hands over their eyes. It's so radiant, so glorious, so awesome this scene is. But the bottom part of the painting is happening at the very same moment. There's the father holding his son. There's the son suffering from epilepsy. There are the disciples trying to do something, unable to do anything. The scene is much darker, more chaotic, filled with despair. It feels like at the top part of that painting, nothing is impossible. It feels like in the bottom part of that painting, nothing is possible. Both parts taking place at the very same time. And what the text in Matthew and what Raphael, the painter, is saying to us is that these contrasts describe our own lives. That there are seasons in our lives, hours long, days long, years long, when we feel like we are on the mountaintop. We are in the presence of God. We feel connected to Christ. We're able to see Jesus in new ways. There's hope. There's optimism. Our faith flows as easily as breathing up there on the mountaintop. And there are other seasons of our lives, sometimes hours long, sometimes days long, sometimes years long, when we're the ones down in the valley, when there's nothing but suffering and despair and pessimism and a sense that God is nowhere near any of this. And God is doing nothing about any of this. It feels like many teenagers in our own country right now are living in the bottom part of that painting, living in the second half of this text in Matthew 17. One recent study finds that 1 in 3 American teenagers have considered suicide in the last year. 1 in 3. 1 in 5 LGBTQ teens have attempted suicide in the last year, 1 in 5. And depression rates among teenagers in this country have doubled between 2009 and 2019. And that was before the pandemic hit. It feels like many teenagers in our own country have moved down into the valley, and that is their primary experience in life. I think we could say that many in Ukraine are feeling like life is down in the bottom part of this picture, the second half of the text, as we now mark the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and 100,000 Ukrainians have died, 30,000 civilian casualties. And yet, there are some of us, even in this room, even online, at this very moment, who feel like we resonate more with the top part of that picture, with the mountaintop experience. I think of how Deborah and Annie have recovered from injuries to their shoulders, their arms. I think of how Charles has had 2 successful surgeries over the last few weeks with both eyes, now seeing clearly. I think of the beautiful snow that many of us took great delight in this last Tuesday. These feel like mountaintop experiences. I think of the way that Frank is flourishing right now. These feel like mountaintop experiences. Here in this room, as we look around, we have no idea which part of the portrait people are occupying. There are some in this very space living down below. There are some in this space who are dwelling up on top, on that mountain. Now, both of these spaces, both parts of this text, carry with them their own temptations and their own requirements. The temptation on the mountaintop is to prolong the experience past its purpose. And so we read in Matthew 17, verse 4, "Then Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I will set up 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah.'" This is probably taking place during the Feast of Booths, when the Jewish people would set up tents or booths to commemorate the wilderness time of the people of God as they made their way to the promised land. And that's probably what lies behind Peter's proposal here. And so it's a proposal that has lots of layers of meaning to it, but at its core, it is a proposal to extend this experience. Jesus, let's settle in. Let's put roots down. Let's dig down and enjoy this experience as long as we possibly can. Because that is almost always the temptation when it comes to mountaintop moments in our lives. We want to extend them, sometimes beyond their purpose. And yet, as quickly as this mountaintop moment begins, it ends. The clouds dissipate, Moses and Elijah are gone, and Jesus alone stands before them. And then they leave the mountain for the valley below. But the temptation is to always prolong these experiences beyond their purpose. Diane Langberg, in her book, Suffering in the Heart of God, tells a graphic example of this. She was touring Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, a place where hundreds of thousands of Africans had been taken, placed in the dungeons, and then forced onto slave ships and taken to Europe and to America. And she writes that as she stood in the dungeons of this castle, their tour guide pointed upward to the ceiling and then described how on the other side of that ceiling sat a chapel, a place above of worship, of joy, of connection, of meaning, a place below of enslavement and suffering and despair. And at its worst, that's what can happen with mountaintop moments. We become so preoccupied with our joy and our connection and our experience that we lose sight of what's happening down below. The temptation in the valley is to believe that with Jesus seemingly absent, everything is up to us. And so we read in verse 16, the Father, "And I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him." Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" He said to them, "Because of your little faith." What lies behind the frustration of Jesus here is the fact that the disciples had no faith in the valley. And what this seems to mean is that when faced with the pain and the despair of the valley, they believed it was entirely up to them. They believed that they were on their own. There were no divine resources available down here in the valley. There was no divine presence available down here in the valley. So there was no praying, there was no fasting, there was no faith. There were just poor attempts to deal with the suffering on their own. And that is often the temptation when we find ourselves in the low spots in our lives. We tend to believe that God is gone, that God has no resources for us, and that if we are to make anything out of this experience, it's going to rely entirely upon us. But just as each space has their own temptation, each space has their own requirement. And so the requirement of the mountaintop is listening. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they raised their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. This mountaintop moment has a great impact, especially on Peter. He writes about this later in his letters. And I suppose there were many benefits for these three from this mountaintop experience. But the primary requirement was to listen. What God wanted most for them in this mountaintop moment was to listen. And the same is true for us. There may be many benefits that we experience when we find seasons of life, when life is good and there's hope and optimism and we feel full of faith and we feel connected to God. Those times on the mountaintop can renew us, they refresh us, they recharge us, but the requirement is to listen. The requirement when we find ourselves in the best spaces of life should be to ask ourselves, what is Jesus saying to me through this mountaintop experience? What is God's word to me in this mountaintop experience? I've been somewhat dismayed at the avalanche of online commentary that exists now as it relates to the Asbury revival. Perhaps you've heard that earlier in February at Asbury University in Kentucky, after a regularly scheduled student chapel, the students stayed, and that little chapel service turned into a massive revival. 15,000 people a day coming to that revival at Asbury University in Kentucky. It's been compared to another revival that took place there back in 1970. And with that revival has come an onslaught of online critique and analysis and questioning about its authenticity. But what if with that mountaintop moment, we believe that the only requirement was to listen? What is Jesus saying to us through that mountaintop moment? What might we learn from Christ through that mountaintop moment? Every mountaintop season in our lives can provide wisdom if we'll listen, can provide perspective if we'll listen. That's the requirement of the mountain. The requirement of the valley is faith as small as a mustard seed. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why couldn't we cast it out?" And he said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." Clearly, there's some frustration undergirding these words from Jesus, but there's also enormous comfort to be found in them. Because what Jesus is saying is that when you're in those low spots, I don't expect you to have the same kind of faith that you have up there on the mountain. What I need you to have is faith as small as a mustard seed, one of the smallest seeds known to us. And what Jesus seems to be telling the disciples is if they had just had the smallest amount of faith down there in the valley, then that valley experience would have turned into a mountaintop experience, at least from the perspective of that son and that son's father. Because in the valley, with faith as small as a mustard seed, nothing is impossible. And how comforting that is. Because often in the low parts of our lives, that's about all that we can muster. And Jesus is saying, if you'll just find some place in your heart, some place in your mind to believe that even here in this darkness, even here in this chaos, even here in this pain, that God still has provisions for you and that God is still present to you, then this valley can become a mountaintop. I think one of the things that's happening with this text and with this painting of this text is that it's normalizing both the mountain and the valley. So the next time you find yourself on a mountain, in a high point in life, don't feel guilty. Don't feel like it's undeserved. Accept the invitation to the mountain and take it in for all that it is worth. Trust that Jesus has brought this season of rest, this season of revelation to you as a gift, and receive it as a gift. And while that season lasts, listen. Seek wisdom from Christ. Seek perspective from Christ. And recognize that generations of people have experienced these mountains, these moments on the mountain, because it's a natural part of life with God. And the same is true with the valley. The next time you find yourself in a low place in life, trust that this too is part of a healthy, flourishing life with God. Generations of people have experienced time in the valley. Followers of Christ have spent time in the valley. And at the same moment that you're there are others in their own valley. And while you're there, seek that faith as small as a mustard seed and trust that that season will come to an end. Because life with God is never only about the valley. There's a remarkable little text in 1 Kings 20. Syria is warring against the people of God, against Israel, and taunting them with this little line, "The Lord God is a God of the hills, but not a God of the valleys." And so then God acts through Israel to show these enemies that in fact he is a God of the mountains and a God of the valleys. And I think that might be a key takeaway from this text in Matthew 17. Because as we read that whole text, we find that Jesus is present in both places. Jesus is with the three up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and then he brings the three down with him into the valley. And so no matter where you are in the presence of Christ. Mountain and valley, both are home